Hello everyone, welcome to EMD Media's weekly show, the H panel. Today, as usual, we'll be talking about a topic of interest, but as usual, we'll start with the usual format of asking the panelists what stood out for them, what is the highlight of the week for our panelists. And it's my great pleasure to have two panelists today, Duke Burbridge and Alamayo Waldemariam. Alex has been here before at least one time, but I will do an introduction for those who might haven't seen that show. And then Duke is here for the first time, and we will be talking about massacres of civilians under Ethiopia's skies. This is a topic for the H panel today, and I think it's exactly 1 year since Alamayo was with the UMD Media. He is a Horn of Africa security and democracy political commentator. He has been writing on a number of topics. One of his articles, which is relevant for today, will be also raising that in the show. You can follow him on Twitter, Alemayo Fantao. He was a senior research associate at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy for 15 years. Uh, he worked on a number of projects, including Pakistan, Yemen, Colombia, in terms of peace building, which is relevant to today's topic. And he also did research and education on radicalization in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, on how religious leaders could help in this kind of violent extremism. And he was working since 2021 on a book on reforming outside-led peace building. Unfortunately, because of what's happening in Ethiopia, in Tigray, he has paused that project and he's very active in raising awareness on genocide uh, against Tigrayans. And you can follow him on Twitter as well at Burbridge Duke. That is his Twitter account. It's my great pleasure to have you both, and welcome to MD Media's H panel.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Duke. So, what is the highlight for you before we go into the topic? What was the highlight of the past 7 days for
Well, in the past 7 days, it seems like there's been a lot more of sticking to the same themes that we've become sadly accustomed to. Of course, we'll talk about the civilian massacre in Oromia later. That's now the 28th, I think, civilian massacre in Oromia in 2022 alone, according to ACLED, whose data is not very good on Tigray, but is a little better in Oromia. And that's sadly a pattern that has been going on. Also in Tigray, the same pattern of civilians, starving civilians, not being able to access humanitarian assistance. There was a delegation this week from the EU that was able to get into Tigray and they came back with essentially the same report that we've been seeing from the data, that some food is getting in, but they don't have the fuel to distribute the food. They don't have enough access to medicine. They don't have basic services. These are all forms of collective punishment against civilians. What we've seen, sadly, is these cycles of violence and deprivation against civilians sadly continue. So what struck me from last week was just the fact that this is still going on. This is still happening, and there are no. I don't see any real solutions in sight. There are some peace processes happening. They're moving at a glacial pace, and this is also a problem because this is the time needed to make these things real are paid for with the lives of civilians. the time needed for the government to take seriously the threats to civilians in Oromia is being paid for with the lives of civilians, and that doesn't appear to stop. Any of these news stories from this week should have been an impetus to shift gears in Addis Ababa to protect civilians, and it hasn't been, unfortunately.
Thank you, Doc. Alex, what about you? What did they highlight for you over the past 7 days?
Uh, well, two things. To start with the good news. It's really heartening to see that the warring parties in the Ethiopian civil war have made have seem to have made quantum leap toward this peace. So at least the warring parties have agreed to meet in Nairobi under the mediation led by Kenyan President Kenyatta. On the other hand, I'm horrified to read wire news reports of another atrocity, this time around committed in Western Walaga, in a town called Gimbi. And according to those reporters, at least 230 people of ethnic Amhara origin were killed allegedly by the Oromo Liberation Army, which itself denied of committing the crimes and put the blame on the retreating forces of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. But it's important here to note that these atrocities, the same kind of atrocity against ethnic Amhara, was committed some 2 years ago, some 3 days before the start of the Ethiopian Civil War on November 1, 2020.
Alex, did you cut off or?
Yes, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so that is actually the topic of the day. So we'll be talking about massacres of civilians under Ethiopia's skies. Duke was alluding to the fact that even in one region, it's over close to 30. And if we are to expand the time frame of civilians as victims in masses, in numbers, I think it's uh, painful even to count. This is the UMD Media, in collaboration with Joseph Garewa, did on the mass killings in Tigray. So you can see that almost everywhere in Tigray was done. This was just covering before June 2021. And then if you look at the different organizations that were tracing mass killings in Ethiopia, it's almost everywhere in numbers and so on. So let's talk about that. Alex, you wrote, I think it was in November 2020. Let me pull if I can that map where you talk about this sad story of a man that was killed in public square. This is from 2020. So Alex, maybe I let me continue with that. So how have you been following civilians for different reasons by different actors, but always civilians are the victims?
Yes, Getachew. So yes, this article was the last article I published on Ethiopia. And it was published first in February 2020. And it was republished by the Africa Report, actually, after the war erupted. So the original article was published in Ethiopia Insight, and it was published on 9th of February 2020. So the thrust of the argument I was making is that under Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia is on a course to anarchy. And in that course, what they call the reform process is going to cost a lot of lives at a large scale. And to be precise, mass atrocity crimes will be committed by all parties involved in the conflicts that we're going to unfold, as I predicted then, tried to predict then. Then, as you see, I mean, a lot of fault lines we had, all of them resurfaced. You have those intercommunal, inter-ethnic fault lines, religious fault lines, all kinds of nationalisms at loggerheads, the pan-Ethiopian Ethiopian nationalism, the ethno-nationalisms of the different ethnic groups that make up Ethiopia, and the religious nationalism that my friend Andrew Duckworth has recently published about. So all fault lines were resurfacing, and that's what we are witnessing now.
Yeah, now on the same question, Duke, I know you have been following what's happening down there closely and actively. So, if you were to paint a picture, because the picture that we get from the state media, from the government, from the prime minister is green legacy.
Mm.
You know, planting seedlings here, this number, and so on. Whereas we are seeing, you know, if people were forced, we are basically seeing, you know, a deforestation in big numbers. So if you were to paint a picture, you know, vis-a-vis what is being painted by the state media, what would that look like in terms of civilians as victims?
Well, honestly, the anarchy that he just mentioned, you know, I'm not familiar with the precise definition of anarchy, but when the government is acting as just another armed group, I mean, if you look, when I mentioned 27 massacres, or 28 now massacres in Oromia, the government, federal or regional troops were 9 were attributed to them, a full third. And so that seems to be anarchy, that when the government is no more than a participant in some of these conflicts, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants. I would say the picture that can be seen from outside Ethiopia, and this is where I haven't been to Ethiopia since early 2020 when COVID, I had to leave. But from outside Ethiopia, we see civilians, the lives of civilians not being valued in any of these conflicts by the Ethiopian government, who's supposed to be, I mean, their role is to protect civilians. So it does seem that the life of a tree is valued somewhat higher than the life of a civilian right now by the government. I know that may be a controversial thing to say, but it's very difficult to know precisely what has happened in Tigray. With There are several people who have been tracking the civilian massacres, and that's only one of a number of atrocities that we know have happened. We know that these horrible things have happened. We don't know to what degree, to what scale they've happened. All we know is that it has been probably unprecedented. But what we're looking at here is a breakdown, and forgive the expression, but a complete breakdown of law and order that's starting with the government, where the government is not distinguishing between civilians and combatants. And that is the picture that we're seeing, is that there is this mayhem happening that nobody seems to have a solution for in Addis, where they're supposed to be having a discussion right now, I guess, about the strategy of the Law and Order campaign, Law and Order, but it hasn't resulted in any tangible response other than we're going to keep starving the people in Tigray. We're going to launch another military incursion into Oromia, and that's going to be the solution. And so it just seems like bad solutions being thrown after really serious problems of civilian vulnerability, to massacres on one hand or to starvation, deprivation on the other.
One thing that is usually, Alex, you were mentioning about a number of factors at play. One thing that, relatively speaking, for me might be a new phenomenon during the past, let's say, 4 years, is the normalizing. Even the prime minister a number of times was quoted as saying, compared to number of people dying in the US, or compare, the number of deaths there, this is nothing. So he was, publicly saying that. But not only that, there is a strong, group, I would say, that would also again justify this or that killing because of that on behalf of the government or the prime minister. So what is your reading of where we are in terms of, seeing these horrific massacres? I mean, Tigray, like I was pointing out, has been all over the place in terms of mass killing, genocide, and so on. So there was a mass support for that. We are not, undermining the voices that we heard here and there, even within Ethiopia, but the mass support was there. But let's talk about, civilian massacres in general, and how do you read the justification or the normalizing from the prime minister and his support base?
For me, the trajectory isn't going to change. It's not only that the trajectory isn't going to change, but looking back, as we all know, Abiy Ahmed and company came to power on the back of populist ethno-nationalist protest movements, fueled up by resentments, and these resentments were targeted against a certain ethnic group or a political party that was in power. That's the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So that resentment, that populist resentment, had to create an enemy, a scapegoat. So it wasn't limited. That resentment wasn't only limited to the political forces that were in power. I mean, the PLF, but it was targeted against the entire people of Tigray. So, like the Jews in the Second World War, like the Jews were the scapegoats for all the social, economic, and political ills that Germany, the Weimar Republic of Germany, the German people were inflicted. The forces, the elites that tried to wrestle power from the TPLF framed it in the same manner as the Nazis did with respect to the Jews, that there is a certain group of people within Ethiopia that's exploiting its resources, that's in control of the economy, the political power, and everything. So that we need not only remove the TPLF from federal government, but also exterminate the people that the TPLF represents. So this is how the what they call the change, right? The change of regime came about. So the trajectory, the people that led that revolution knew that anarchy, a state of anarchy, some sort of chaos was going to work to their benefit. So, as long as the point is for Abiy Ahmed and company to stay in power, I mean, this is not about having a political program, having a democratizing platform. But as long as their agenda is to stay in power, anarchy works, and it's working for them.
Yeah, uh, I think that's where the civilian victims becomes even more painful. That there are groups, there are the wealthy and the politically well-powered and well-fueled group are benefiting from this. And as long as they are benefiting and nobody is held to account, that sadly and unfortunately will continue. Duke, what is your take on the role of different actors, media, the international community? We will also come back to that in terms of the way out. But in terms of enabling, as they say in law, by omission or commission, who are the people who are enabling this or who are just let it happen?
Yeah. Um, to start with the international community in this respect, when I was there in 2019, it was obvious that there were human rights abuses in Oromia. It was not as obvious how the extent of it was not as accessible. That information wasn't as accessible as it is today, but it was obvious that this was happening. I've often wondered what would happen if back at a time when everybody was still friends, when everybody was still friendly, talking, when Abiy was the next, great young reformer, when people were still, when there was still some political capital, some influence, some positive influence to spend. If the United States or the UN, the international community, would have said right then, what you're doing in Oromia is too far. This is something that we cannot support. We cannot support these. The reforms you're making are great. It's wonderful that some of these social reforms and some of these economic reforms and political reforms, people are being let out of prison. It's wonderful that these things are happening, but you do have to respect the human rights of civilians. If we would have done that back then, would we have been able to prevent so much slaughter? And it's not, some people may say it's not the role of one person or another, but the West did a lot to prop him up, and it seems like that would have been a moment to do something. But at that moment, we were very focused, it seemed, on Jawar. He's a troublemaker. We were a little weird about it because I think at that point he was still a U.S. citizen, and it was people looking at him as somebody who was getting in the way of this great idea that Abiy had, was going to be to form this single political party to rule Ethiopia. Of course, we know that's never been tried before, but they seem to think that it was going to work this time. But that would have been a moment for the international community to do something. Now, turning to within Ethiopia, the state, anybody in my line of work that has worked primarily with countering violent extremism was, I think, particularly upset to see the extent to which the state, along with some of the state affiliated media, along with some of the popular, influential people that are in the political elite, the extent they were going to go to, as the gentleman was saying, to dehumanize Tigrayans or to associate them with, of course, we've all heard the 27 years of the rule. It going so far as to go into these places and mobilizing civilian militias. This scared the hell out of me. To mobilize civilians to defend their areas with machetes, with rudimentary weapons. That's not a great idea. That leads to retaliation. That leads to very difficult situation. Nothing can excuse the death of a civilian at the hands of an armed group. There are some factors that could contribute to that death, is what I'm saying, in those things appeared to be happening, particularly after the Ethiopian troops were pushed out of Tigray around this time last year. And it seemed to be a terrible situation in the making for what was going on. So the media, of course I'm only able to access the English speaking media for the most part. Translation is still not great, but the media, the stories that do get translated that I do hear have been horrible, have been, if you take some of the quotes that we've heard from political figures in places like Amhara, the regional government there, it's hard to distinguish them between the rhetoric that I used to hear in counterterrorism, where they are demonizing an entire people, where they are advocating for, I mean, many of them stop short of advocating explicitly to kill civilians, but where they are definitely trying to make the point that the combatants and civilians, that there's not a big difference between them. And that's such a dangerous point to make. And so there's been a lot of drivers. And once you have those determined drivers of violence or conflict, then a lot of what we look at as the more subtle drivers of conflict sort of melt away. The idea of relative deprivation, I'm sure there were these feelings beforehand. There's feelings of that in most conflicts, but these were throttled by media reports, by government statements, by in some cases by the diaspora, saying that the Tigrayans, they have all of the wealth, they have everything. They were benefiting so much for the past 27 years, and now it's time to take them down to the level that they should be, which is, there's been videos of people talking about that on the battlefield, like on the front lines, soldiers talking to groups of soldiers about how good the Tigrayans have had it for the past 27 years. That's a very, very dangerous thing. That is something you never want to see happen in a military uniform. At least that's when it's gotten to a point of almost no return.
Yeah, one thing that, speaking about the atrocities and who should do what, Alex, there was a moment when the Tigray genocide was happening live. Uh, Many were silenced, including the most powerful person in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Patriarch. And there was an artist, Dishtagina, who was in a war supporting rally, spoke his mind, and he was being pushed to say he regretted saying that and so on. Let me play that clip from 7 months ago, and you can give us a picture where those who should normally talk about peace and reconciliation or rule of law, bringing those who are committing atrocities to court and so on, were silenced. So let's see this clip.
ልዘፍን አይደለም የመጣው በደስታውም ባዘን መስፈን ብቻ ነው እንዴ? የሚዘፈንና የማይዘፈን ቃል ይወቃ። እኔም ራሴ የቱ ጋር ቆሜ ልስፈን? የቱ ጋር ቆሜ ልዘምር? የቱ ጋር ቆሜ ልናገር? እንደዚህ ተጣቧል ሰፈሩ። እኔ የሚዘፍነውም የለም የሚናገረውም የለም። በዘፈኑም ካልተማረን በመዝሙሩም ካልተማረን የሚዘፈን ነገር የለም። አሁን የሚዘመርም ነገር የለም። በመዝሙሩም አልተማርንም።
Maybe Alex, you can start from what was going on then and there, and your reading of what happened to this artist or to his voice.
Getachew, this is really, you know what, this it has a lot. This episode has a lot to tell us about how the war was conducted and how the civilian population was mobilized in support of the war on both sides. So this one shows you how the Ethiopians were mobilized in support of the war against Tigray, and how peace, even talk of peace, became a taboo, a subject that was a no-go. You can't set foot even in any talk, in any discourse, whatever, of peace. So, I mean, this guy, if you take a look at his biography, this guy is a former soldier. So he knows the horrors of war. He has been there. He has experienced it firsthand. And he was telling them that he wasn't there to perform. He was telling them that even on a day like this, it's important to ponder on the horrors of war, that they should know there is a day when they shouldn't be celebrating, feasting, kind of thing, singing a song. So he was telling them he's not going to sing a song. He wanted to convey a message, but he was taken off that stage. Not only that he was taken off that stage, but he was made to appear on TV and apologize to the Ethiopian public. They made him cry, kneel down on the floor, and apologize. Then he said, at another appearance, he was saying that he came from the countryside and that he's going back to where he belongs. And he did that. He went back. He made another appearance on TV. I saw him lately on Seifu Fantaun's show on EBS. Seifu invited him because he has already released a single, and that single itself he asked him what it's about, and it's about love. And he asked him, "What are you doing? Are you a preacher or are you a singer?" He said, I live between the two worlds. So what this particular episode tells us is how people were mobilized for the war, how there was no space for entertaining even the idea of peace. It was a very sad moment for most of us. Yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah, I think I got that moment you mentioned about him appearing, and he was made to apologize and to cry for just preaching peace and so on. So let me just play a bit of that.
ሲመጣው 10 ሳንቲም አይጠቅመውም። ሰው ከፍቶ አይቶ ላይክ አድርገኝ ሼር አድርገኝ ምናምን አድርገኝ የተባለ የሚደረገው ነገር ምንም አይጠቅመውም።
ታሪኩ እንግዲህ ተጨማሪ ሀሳብ ካለ
ለሀገር እኔ መናገር የምፈልገው ፖለቲከኛም አይደለሁም ምንም አይደለሁም። ብቻ ሰው ነኝ። ዝም ብዬ ከሰው ጋር መኖር ያስፈልገኛል። ሰው ስለሆንኩ ሰው አዝኖብኝ ደግሞ መኖር እኔ ትርጉም የለውም። ስለዚህ ለኢትዮጵያ ሰላም ነው የሚመኘው።
Yeah, he's saying that he's just an ordinary human being, that he's not a politician. It's amazing, look.
Yeah, it's painful, and his only crime was preaching peace in a war rally, and yeah, that is the against the backdrop of the mass mobilization against Tigray at that time. I was mentioning about the patriarch as well, His Holiness Abuna Matthias. He had actually to take two unconventional, rare, unofficial channels he got. So he is the head of the church. Over half the population is Ethiopian Orthodox Church follower, but he was as well silenced. So the point is, bringing it back to the topic, massacres of civilians. If known famous artists cannot speak against this kind of atrocities, if the head of the biggest church, the oldest church in the country, arguably even in the continent, cannot speak and is silenced by state machinery, church machinery, and so on. By the way, I will be speaking with Andrew on his recent article that was published on foreign policy tomorrow. So I'll be making an announcement later on. But with this backdrop, with this situation, what are the entry points, Duke? Maybe from in one of the works you did, it was using conservative religious leaders that could be heard to counter extremism and so on. So we are seeing one or another form of extremism, but always ending up in massacres of civilians in the country. So do you see entry points in terms of what people can do, even if the price that they will be paying is what we see on TV, on prime time, on an entertainment, in the middle of entertainment show, he had to cry, saying, I did wrong to the people of Ethiopia because I preached peace.
Right, right, and in that moment, it just seemed like an example of what had been going on elsewhere in Ethiopia, where people that I had been friends with, colleagues, where they had a moment of, wait, guys, we need to understand that there are some boundaries to what we're doing here, and having to make these tearful apologies for being a human being rather than a politician, which has become a taboo. Like we were saying, this has become a taboo because it got immediately framed as counterterrorism. And I realize that speaking in America as an American, it's a little rich hearing me talk about the abuse of the terrorist label, because this has been done by America as well as by other countries. But once that label was stuck on the TPLF, then anything at peace with a terrorist is much different than peace with the other people in your country. And so this set them on a path to an unending war. And it set them on a path to where collective punishment became something that they were using. Collective punishment is a good way to win a war as long as you're willing to never stop fighting it. And that seems to be what's happening. The entry point for religious actors, when I did research about conservative religious actors who are normally blamed for extremism, the roles that they want to play and that they can play in pulling people away from extremism, the one advantage was that in most of the countries that I was looking at, the conservative religious actors were not co-opted by the state. And therefore they had independence to say certain things without losing their salaries or their stipends or their preferred status. This is one thing that in many cases a Salafi will have that maybe a more traditionalist or somebody closer to the government will not have. And it's very difficult for a religious actor to come into a situation and de-escalate it or counter some of the radical narratives that are going on if they're still beholden to the state that are committing some of these acts or that sort of need this chaos to survive. So it's very difficult. I do wish that leaders from the evangelical community, of which Abiy Ahmed is a part, would talk about this a little bit more. I wish that the Vatican would speak about this a little bit more. These are still outside actors. On the inside, most of my relationships, most of my research was with the Ethiopian Islamic community, and I've seen some troubling narratives coming out of some actors there, but not all. I do wish that they would talk about the legality of starvation as a weapon, as being something that's completely counter to Islam. I only saw a few clips or video clips of people using religious arguments from the Muslim community. There was I believe it was the mayor of was it Daradawa in the south, quoting a sutra that talked about that they are people that had to be destroyed, which was a perversion of the doctrine. But it's hard to know who would have the I don't know, the political capital and the influence to essentially take on the government in this place, because the government should be in favor of peace. All of these law and order campaigns or wars or whatever they're going to call them is intended, according to them, for peace. So then peaceful messages should be something that are positive, but they would have to fight the government, just like that gentleman on the stage was doing. They would have to fight back against the government to do that. And there are so many ways that the government can take them down, even though the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is no longer as directly linked to the government as it was in previous administrations. There's still a number of ways that their voices can be suppressed. And so I mean, in back 10 years ago, it was Muslims who were being universally tagged as being terrorists by certain elements of the Ethiopian government at the time. This is a familiar dehumanization that has happened to Ethiopian Muslims. It's happened to Oromos. It's happened to people in Tigray, and it will happen to anybody who opposes. It looks like anybody who opposes this one party government that they're putting together and trying to hold on to. So I guess essentially it makes them an enemy of the state, as we saw in that clip. It makes them an enemy to oppose violence. And that really takes the legs out from underneath any influential actor inside Ethiopia that wants to see this stop. Of course, there are going to be brave exceptions to that. But yeah, very challenging to see where this comes from.
Yeah. Alex, I know you were making efforts in terms of discussions on Clubhouse and wherever possible in terms of reasoning, for people to come together, at least at minimum, in my reading, two things. One, no civilian, no person, should be exposed, should be going through this kind of, massacres or killings or anything because of who they are, because of the God they believe in, or any, identities they identify with. And secondly, wherever these kind of crimes happen, those who are perpetrating that should be brought to, face justice and so on. So, do you see any hope on, at least bringing a critical mass to agree on this? Because as Andrew in his article argues that uh, there are people who are supporting atrocities, including genocide here, and then becoming victim there. So this is a kind of perpetuating story. So do you see any hope? Do you see again the same question of where is the entry point for anyone to act, sanely? You are muted, Alex.
All right.
Yeah.
So this war between the federal government of Ethiopia and its allies on the one hand, and the Tigray regional government, is being fought on unprecedented level of violence, of viciousness. It's so grotesque. Ethiopia, Ethiopia is a country that claims that prides itself of being the longest running independent African nation. All right. You can take it 3,000 years, at least the core Abyssinia nation. But Ethiopians haven't fought. This is not the first civil war that Ethiopia fought, but Ethiopians have never fought a vicious civil war of this level in their history. Communal groups, ethnic groups. Tigrayans mobilizing against Amharas mobilizing against Tigrayans or other ethnic groups. Afar Somali, Oromo. But the thing is, if this war is like is worse, the worst is yet to come. So the question for me, the $1 million question for me is how to break the vicious cycle of civil wars in Ethiopia. So this is my problem with Tigray's independence, for instance. I don't have any problem with Tigray being independent, but my problem is how do you safeguard the people of Tigray? How do you ensure their safety while they are encircled by enemies who are not going to go away? The Amhara are going to be there forever, But this war and the way it's being fought is sowing seeds for future wars. Eritreans are our neighbors. They are going to be there forever, as long as humanity is there. Our Afari neighbors. So the thing is, if we are going to resolve this conflict, we have to resolve this conflict in a way that breaks any potential vicious cycle of civil wars in the future. So independence, I don't think independence is going to guarantee that outcome, that desired outcome of safety for the people of Tigray. So I mean, in trying to start my clubhouse, my point was, it was early in the war, like we were talking about with respect the singer Tariku Gankasi, Dishtagina, any talk of peace was a taboo. We weren't allowed to go there. But what I was trying to do was to bring Ethiopians, non-Tigrayan Ethiopians and Tigrayans together and talk. Because at that time, everybody was avoiding each other. Everybody was in his own room, and mobilizing support for the war, not talking about peace. That engaging the Amhara was impossible. Engaging the Eritrean was impossible. But this is not sustainable. I mean, that kind of avoidance, this avoidance approach wasn't sustainable. I mean, even the warring parties are not going to fight till kingdom come. They have to stop at some point and talk. That's what they are doing. So their supporters, so I think one responsibility of the warring parties themselves is, to signal to your own constituency responsibly. Wars stop. They will stop one day. But the kind of enmity that you instill can be a seed for future wars. So, so one other thing that was motivating me was I was troubled, by the silence by the grotesque, by the viciousness of the atrocities that were being committed, and by the deafening silence of most of Ethiopians at what was happening to Tigrayans, ordinary civilian Tigrayan population, not even their perceived enemies. I mean, the PLF or any political group whatsoever. I mean, for instance, there is this Jewish writer, Elie Wiesel, a Nobel Prize winner. He has written a book, a famous one, Night. I mean, the central theme of that book is how the worst crime humanity has ever faced, that's genocide, the extermination of the 6 million Jews, took place while the rest of the world was silent. That's it. And he says, the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's indifference. It's moral apathy. How is it possible? How did we get here? So if we are going to stop atrocities, we have to talk. We have to break the silence. That's it, Gage.
That you mentioned about independence and so on, I think we are not at that stage, but there are people, reasonable people arguing that if Tigray was an independent country, the silence of the international community and even what could be possibly done in terms of, at least saving the population would have been a different factor. So, but I think that's a subject for another day. So maybe, we are to be close to the hour. Duke, final thoughts, parting thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, my final thoughts on this is that there needs to be a change in. I mean, I talk about the genocide happening in Tigray right now. by the deprivation of humanitarian assistance to starving civilians. This is seems to be a clear, very textbook case of the third genocidal act recognized by the Rome Statute. That is something that should be provoking action from the international community. The international community appears to be taking a tactic that is often called quiet diplomacy. I've been a part of projects that have used this sort of strategy to do things that were not terribly urgent to do. It's something that takes a long time. All diplomacy is quiet to a certain degree. You don't have diplomacy with cameras on you in front of everybody unless it's public diplomacy. But quiet diplomacy means being quiet about things that you would rather not see happen. And in the case of starving civilians, in the case of people who have a very definitive time left to live that they can go without their medicine, without food, this becomes appeasement, quiet diplomacy. When you have the Department of State, there are wonderful people who work at the Department of State that I think are not being very well served by some of the leadership of the Department of State, who decided to shelve in the beginning of December. They announced that they would not be releasing the genocide determination for Ethiopia. They also announced in a press conference on the same day, I believe it was, Antonio Gutierrez came out and said, the problems are over, the trucks are moving, there's a convoy that just went, and there's another convoy, and he was right, there were 2 convoys, and then there were no more convoys until April 1st of the next year. This is a very optimistic, I wish that the international community would lose a little bit of their optimism when it comes to statements that come out of Addis or promises that are being made. I wish that they would enforce the responsibility to protect. There's been some movement on that. In the EU, I'm not sure if this is, if the statement that they made, I believe it was yesterday, I'm not sure if that has any teeth. The statement that the US government made about using hunger as a weapon of war, I'm not sure if that has any teeth, because that's to be interpreted by the Department of State. They have not moved on legislation that would actually compel the Department of State to take actions in response to violence or genocide or starvation or human rights abuses against civilians. They have not taken that up in the proper ways. HR 660 and S 3199 would actually create some mechanisms that have to be followed, and these are not focused on Tigray exclusively, and they're not focused against the Ethiopian government exclusively. These are about whoever is killing civilians, whoever's abusing the human rights of civilians. And these are things that the international community needs to get serious about. They've been very serious about promoting this national dialogue. I was very much in favor of a national dialogue in 2019. But the national dialogue needs to have the conditions set for it to be effective, or we could see what happened in Yemen. They had a national dialogue. It stretched way too long. But it was inclusive. Everybody says they have to be inclusive. It included, I think, more than 550 people. Women, for the first time, were included in making decisions on certain levels, and that you had youth included. Some people were not included, were very upset about that. But at the end of it, it ended with a closed door deal on perhaps the most important issue, and just spirals of recommendations ranging from gun control to taxes and then distribution of resources. These things can go horribly wrong, and to get a national dialogue to be effective, you have to get buy-in from the public. Now, to get buy-in from the public, you have to make the public think that there is the opportunity to see real change come out of a national dialogue. And if the public thinks that there's going to be real change, and at the end of it, there's not real change, it looks like a huge opportunity was missed, and people then get very angry, and groups get very angry. And a national dialogue held in bad circumstances, in bad faith, because it's still, I don't think, legal to publish an article contravening the Ethiopian government's narrative of the war, where there's still all of these repressions, where somebody from Tigray can still be arrested and detained without formal charges. If all of these things are happening at the same time as a national dialogue, and they've picked the people already, then the national dialogue is meaningless at best, and it can be a catalyst for an unending war that will bring about the collapse of the country at worst. I hope to God that that never happens. I'm not predicting that would happen, but those are the stakes that they're playing with. And the international community being so gung-ho for this national dialogue is very concerning, because this is what appears to be their new silver bullet for resolving conflict. Let's just get everybody in the room and have them all talk. And let's forget about the fact that the Secretary General, the Secretary of State, and everybody down the line hasn't been doing their job and enforcing international humanitarian law, holding people accountable to their international obligations. And as long as that continues to happen, we're in bad shape. These negotiations can go forward. Hopefully, these will go forward in Nairobi. Hopefully, these will be productive. We'll see a drawdown of. We need to see a demobilization of troops, I believe, because I don't know what's happened to all of the new troops that have been raised. This new army that was raised after the first one was kicked out. If we can see some of these positive things happen, that's wonderful. But we need to have a more responsible international community. There are people that are very much against international interference, and they have good right to be. The international community, the U.S. is no exception to this, and in fact, and sometimes is a very bad actor in this. It has been in situations where they've been holding up authoritarian leader, where they've been promoting things that maybe they shouldn't have been promoting. But in these cases, we need to stick with the basics of human rights, civilian security, international humanitarian law, access to humanitarian goods. These things are the world's responsibility to ensure, because it's never going to be, it should never be allowed to be an issue of sovereignty. That's the whole concept of genocide, is that it's not a sovereign right. And so these are some things that the international community should be doing and that they're not. And I can recommend what maybe should be happening in Ethiopia, but at the end of the day, I am an outsider. I can, if I'm going to speak for anybody in Ethiopia, I will speak for everybody and say that everybody wants to eat tomorrow. That's as far as I can go. And in some of the political discussions, these are discussions that need to be had. That's been obvious for a while, but there needs to be the right mood, the right circumstances to have them. And during a genocide is not a great time to have them.
Thank you, Doc. I think one of the most important recommendations that should have been implemented a long time ago is, in terms of massacres of civilians, independent investigation and holding
Yes.
to account. Alex, final words?
I would love to talk about this, the issue of the genocide determination that Duke mentioned. I believe part of the reason why the State Department is delaying its determination, releasing its determination, is doing so at this stage would, in its view, be detrimental to peacemaking efforts that are underway. Because if it has to do that now, it means, such determination entails legal obligation. That means it has to act. So if it does do that, then what it means is that it will be at loggerheads with the Ethiopian government, so it will any peace effort will be derailed. But the thing is, the genocide determination will be made. The question is, I mean, it's not going to be made anytime soon. I don't know what to say. If you have any specific question, I can.
Okay. Okay. That's a good point to end today's show. Or Duke, you want to reflect on that, or?
Yeah, just quickly, I do to make the determination today. This is the thing. When I was talking about the quiet diplomacy, it takes a very long time to work, and sadly, we've been placed on this course to where we had to wait so long. Hopefully, this is the moment where it is starting to pay off. And to run out today to make the determination would probably be detrimental. To have made the determination earlier on, I think probably would have had a better result. But yeah, at this point, we have we've been locked into this very slow moving process. Hopefully it starts to pay off soon. There are indications that it might, but those indications have been there before. So we can only hope.
Great.
Yeah. So the second thing I wanted to say was, and I forgot, was the State Department annual human rights country reports for the year 21 came out, and it actually covers those atrocities that were committed during the early stage of the war. So when the report comes next year for this year, because the 21 covers the previous year, 2020. So when the report for 2021 comes out in 2022, there will be more coverage of the atrocity crimes committed in the context of the war in Tigray, against Tigray.
Great. Thank you, Alex and Duke. Tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, as you see it on the screen, In God's Name, Anatomy of Demonization and Radioactive Enmity in Ethiopia. This is a topic I'll be conversing with Andrew Decourt based on his recent article, Christian Nationalism is Tearing Ethiopia Apart. This was published on Foreign Policy this week. And it's a very extensive article that goes back in time on historical aspects, as well as what's happening now in detail in the Abiy Ahmed's way of governing, ruling the country, all that, and so on. So tune in to UMD Media live with Andrew Decourt tomorrow, in God's name. Thank you, gentlemen. And I was looking at the comments, feedbacks, and so on, and people are asking for you to be back on this panel on yet another subject. And I hope you will be able to make that. And thank you for your time, and good night from here.
Thank you, Gage. Thank you, Duke.
Thank you.
Okay. For those who just joined us, we were on the H panel, the weekly H panel that is aired always live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Today's topic was Massacres of Civilians Under Ethiopia's Skies. We started with Gimbi, what happened in Wolaga, but covered all these massacres that have been happening from Tigray genocide and outside Tigray as well. Thank you for following us. We were live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn. And please, as you go out, as we sign off, share, like, subscribe so that many can access our material. That's how the algorithm on YouTube works. The more likes or dislikes or impressions, the more people get access to what we do here. Thank you and good night.